The November dark was not yet finished when the morning room door opened, and Eleanor Brent stepped out of it into the cold passage. Alone, her satchel in one hand, and the estate ledger pressed against her ribs with the other, and did not look back. The drive was long at Ashcroft Manor. She had walked it 100 times in daylight, in summer, when the gravel was pale and the beeches met overhead in a canopy that softened even the hottest afternoon into something bearable. She had walked it in winter, too, on mornings when the frost had not lifted and the trees were bare silhouettes against a low sky, carrying papers to her father in the steward's cottage, or returning from the main house with the household accounts. She knew every unevenness in the gravel, every place where the edging stone had shifted and made a small ridge that caught a heel in the dark. She walked it now, as she had walked it always, with her shoulders straight and her chin level, because the alternative was to let her hands shake, and she did not intend to let her hands shake. The coach to Withmere left the village inn at 5:30. She had perhaps 20 minutes if she walked at a pace that did not break into the indignity of running. Behind her, through the curtained windows of the morning room, the candles were still lit. She did not need to look to know that Lady Dorothea Calder was at her writing table by now, setting down whatever instrument of triumph she had decided upon next. The letter had already been read aloud. The conclusion had already been delivered. Eleanor had gathered what she came to gather, and now she walked. The gate at the end of the drive was iron and high, and it stood open, as it always did before dawn when the kitchen staff began their morning errands. Eleanor passed through it. The road to Withmere was rutted, and she could not see it clearly. She kept to the grass, verge, and walked by feel. She did not cry. She had cried for her father when he died in September, and she had taken 2 days for it. And then she had risen and begun settling the estate accounts, because someone had to, and because it was the only way she knew how to demonstrate that his life had been worth something, that the 30 years he had given to Ashcroft Manor had left the books in order. She was not going to cry for a morning room letter read aloud by a woman whose authority over that cottage was, at best, a question. That word had sustained her through the half-hour she had spent in the morning room listening to Lady Dorothea speak. At best, was a distinction with legal consequence. At best, could be verified. She shifted the ledger under her arm and kept walking. At the coaching inn in Withmere, the ostler was already in the yard when Eleanor arrived. She purchased the inside seat to the assizes with the coins she had kept in the inner pocket of her father's old satchel, and sat down on the bench beside the cold hearth to wait. The fire had gone to embers. She did not ask for it to be built up. The cold was something she could manage. She had been managing it since September in one form or another. 2 other passengers arrived for the same coach, a wool merchant with a sample case, and a clergyman who fell asleep against the window before they had passed the first-mile marker. Eleanor was grateful for the silence. She held the ledger in her lap and looked out at the road, unspooling in the gray early light, the hedgerows dark and bare, the occasional farm gate standing open to a yard that was only beginning to stir. She thought about the notation on page 43 which she had copied in her own hand, from the Chancery roll 3 years ago when she had ridden to London with her father on the matter of a contested boundary survey. They had waited 2 days at the Chancery archive while the clerk located the relevant rolls, and her father had sat on a hard bench in the outer room because the stairs to the reading room were beyond him by then, and Eleanor had gone up alone with the surveyor's reference number written in the margin of her notes, and found, in the 3rd roll she examined, the land grant instrument she had not been looking for. She had recognized it for what it was, immediately. She had copied it in its entirety in the small, close hand she used for instruments, and she had come down and shown it to her father, and he had read it twice and looked at her over the page with an expression she had not quite known how to interpret at the time. Pride. She thought. Now she thought it had been pride. The notation was not in itself the Crown's warrant. It pointed to the instrument that was. She had known for 3 years that it existed. She had never believed she would need it. She believed it now. Eleanor Brent had been born in the steward's cottage at Ashcroft in the autumn of 1801, which made her 23 years old in the November that her father died, and 23 years old on the morning she walked out of the Manor gate in the dark. She was not a romantic figure in the way the season's portraits understood romance. She was slight, with brown hair, she kept in a serviceable knot, and hands that showed the evidence of real work, the ink stains of the estate accounts, the small calluses of a woman who opened and sorted and filed a great deal. She had been educated because her father had seen to it, and because the late Viscount's wife had been a generous woman who permitted Eleanor to sit in the schoolroom with the Calder children during the years when the governess was in residence. She had read Latin. Passably, she had read law, rather well. She had read the land grant instruments for Ashcroft Manor in their entirety because her father had asked her to, and because she had found, to her own surprise, that she understood them in a way he no longer could after his sight began to fail in the winter of 1819. The season had no category for her. She was not a daughter of the house. She was not precisely a servant. She attended no balls, had made no debut, had no portion and no prospect in the conventional understanding of the word. To the ladies of the county who occasionally appeared at Ashcroft for dinners or card parties or the midsummer assembly, she was a pleasant, competent young woman who handled the household's practical matters and who would no doubt find a respectable enough position somewhere once the new Viscount had put his own people in. She had understood, long before Lady Dorothea confirmed it that morning, that this was the general view. She had not resented it, exactly. She had simply set her mouth and continued to be useful, because usefulness was the only coin she had that actually spent. The Viscount Ashcroft had arrived in October, 6 months after his elder brother Frederick's death. Edmund Calder was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was quieter than Frederick had been. He carried himself without the ease of a man accustomed to a welcome, and Eleanor had noticed that first evening, watching from the passage while the household assembled to greet him, that he looked at the rooms of his childhood home the way a man looks at a place he has been asked to manage, rather than a place he has come back to love. He had nodded at her when she presented the accounts 2 days after his arrival. He had asked 3 specific questions, all of them correct, and none of them designed to impress. He had returned the ledger to her without comment, except to say that the October figures required a note in the margin where the quarry payment had been deferred. And she had said she had already noted it, and he had looked at her for a moment and then said, very level, that he could see that she had. She had thought about that look, more than she intended to. She had been in the passage outside the morning room at 5 minutes before 4 o'clock on the morning of the 18th of November, arriving early to deliver the corrected tithe schedule she had finished by candlelight, when she heard Lady Dorothea speak her name. Not to her, to someone else behind the closed door. The steward's girl has managed long enough, Lady Dorothea said, in the easy conversational tone of a woman setting aside a worn household object. It is time. She remembered her place. The voice that answered was younger, lighter, with the polished, careful warmth of a woman performing graciousness. Miss Cecily Rave, Eleanor understood, who had arrived 2 days prior with her mother, and who had been arranged as neatly as furniture in all the rooms where the Viscount was likely to sit. Eleanor had stood in the passage for 3 seconds. Then she had opened the door and walked in. The reading of the letter had taken 4 minutes. Lady Dorothea had done it with a composure that suggested long practice at delivering verdicts. The letter, she said, was from the late Viscount, her husband, and it assigned the steward's cottage and its tenancy to the Rave family's use as a guest accommodation, effective from the date of the steward's death, which was September. Which had passed. Eleanor had listened without interruption. When it was finished, she had said very quietly that she was aware of the letter and had long expected to see it, and that she would be grateful for a quarter of an hour to collect what was hers, and Lady Dorothea had said, with the satisfied small nod of a woman who has concluded a matter, that of course she could have the quarter of an hour. Eleanor had used 8 minutes of it. She had taken her father's satchel, her own spare gown, his copy of Blackstone's commentaries, the page of notation she had been keeping separately in the accounts ledger, and the ledger itself. She had taken the ledger because she had begun working on something inside it that was hers to finish. She was going to finish it today. At the study window on the first floor of Ashcroft Manor at 6 o'clock in the morning, Edmund Calder stood in his dressing gown with the cold glass against his forehead and watched the gray shape of her disappear through the manor gate. He had not known she was leaving. He had come down early because he could not sleep, which was not unusual. The bed in the master's chamber was his brother Frederick's bed, and he found it difficult to lie in it without arriving eventually at the same thought, which was that he had not come home when he should have, and that Frederick had died in it alone in March with Edmund's last letter unreturned in the drawer of the bedside table, the letter in which Edmund had written that he would come in the spring, that the journey was easier in the spring, that he trusted Frederick was not as ill as he said. That brothers overstated these things. Sometimes he had written that. He had sent it and not come. He still had Frederick's final reply in his breast pocket, the one that had arrived 3 days after Frederick's death, postmarked from Ashcroft in February, which Edmund had read once and then folded along its existing creases and put away, because what it contained was a very simple sentence that Frederick had written in the large, unsteady hand of a man losing his grip. Edmund, it does not have to end like this. Come home. Edmund had the letter with him always. He did not know why penance. Perhaps a record of a debt he would not be permitted to repay. He watched Eleanor's gray figure reach the gate and pass through it, and become part of the road beyond, and then vanish into the hedgerow distance. He stood at the glass for a long moment after she was gone. He was trying to name what he had seen in the set of her shoulders, in the careful pace of her, in the way she had not looked back. He could not name it precisely. He knew what it was not. It was not defeat. He went downstairs and asked the first footman he found whether anyone had left the house this morning. The footman said yes, Miss Brent, very early. Lady Dorothea had had her in the morning room before 5. Edmund asked for his mother at breakfast. Lady Dorothea arrived at 8. Composed and pleased with herself in the way she became when something she had arranged had proceeded. As arranged, she wore her good pearl brooch. She explained with the careful reasonableness of a woman who has chosen her ground carefully, that the steward's position and the cottage would be much better administered by someone with more established connections to the county, and that the Rave family had an interest in the property that was both legitimate and convenient, given Cecily's likely future relationship to the house. Edmund listened. He sat with his hands on the table and his face very still. He said when she had finished that she had done this without his knowledge. Lady Dorothea said that she had done what was needed, and that the late Viscount's letter was clear. Edmund said very quietly that the letter was the late Viscount's, and not his, and that decisions regarding tenancy of the cottage fell under his authority, and that she should have spoken to him before she spoke to Miss Brent. Lady Dorothea said that she had not expected him to have a strong feeling on the matter. Edmund looked at her for a moment. Then he said in the same quiet, level way that he would like to speak to Miss Brent today, and that he would like her address. Lady Dorothea said she did not know where the girl had gone. Edmund stood up from the table and went to his study and sat in the chair behind the desk and tried to think of a practical course of action. There was no address. There was no way to know which road she had taken or to whom she might have applied. He could ride to Withmere, but the road forked there in 3 directions, and he did not know which she would have taken. He pressed his hand against the breast pocket of his coat, against the shape of Frederick's letter, and thought that this was what it looked like when a person left and you had not stopped them in time. He had spent 6 months at Ashcroft, being correct and efficient and adequately present, and he had told himself that this was what returning home meant, and he had been wrong. He understood that now, in the morning light of a November day, looking at the accounts ledger she had left on his desk. She had left it deliberately, he understood. She had left the ledger because there was something in it he was supposed to see. He opened it. On page 43, in her precise, neat hand, she had copied a notation from what appeared to be a chancery roll record. It referenced a land grant instrument dated in the 3rd year of the previous reign, which predated the late Viscount's letter by more than 40 years, and which assigned the steward's cottage at Ashcroft Manor to the office of Crown Steward for the estate's duration. The note was signed E. Brent, with the date 3 years prior. At the bottom of the page she had written a single line in different ink, as if added recently. 3 words and a clause. This instrument has not been superseded. The Crown Estates Commissioner holds the original. Edmund read the page twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he understood what she had gone to do. If you have stayed with me this far, I am glad. She did not go quietly. Not really. She went with a legal notation and a very clear idea of where to take it. The afternoon at Ashcroft went on, in the way that afternoons go on at great houses when the mistress of it has arranged things to her satisfaction. Lady Dorothea took tea in the drawing-room with Miss Cecily Rave, and Mrs. Rave and Miss Rave played a very creditable passage on the pianoforte. And 3 other guests arrived for the evening reception that had been planned for a week. And by 4 o'clock the house was full of candle warmth and conversation and the reasonable assumption that the day had concluded well. Lord Fenwick arrived at 4:30 with his wife, and he was given the best chair in the drawing-room, and he held his glass with the comfortable authority of a man who has never held anything else. Edmund was in his study. He had been in his study since 10 o'clock, except for the hour between 2 and 3, when he had ridden to Withmere and asked at the coaching inn which direction the morning passenger had taken. "East," said the ostler. "To the Assizes Junction," meaning she had gone for the Chancery District Clerk's office at Meryton, which was 40 miles, but reachable in a day if the roads held. He had written back and gone back to his desk and sat with the ledger open on page 43 and tried to think of anything he could have done differently this morning that would have produced a different outcome. He could not identify the action. He had been asleep. He had not been consulted. He had not, in the daily management of this house, made himself available to be consulted on the matter of one woman who had been here longer than he had, and who administered these books better than anyone he might have hired to replace her. He had been waiting for whatever this house required of him and had not asked in 6 months what it required of her. He thought about the morning she had presented the accounts 2 days after his arrival, in the East Wing sitting room that still smelled faintly of his brother's tobacco. She had set the ledger on the table and stood beside it and answered his 3 questions in the order he asked them, without the performance of helpfulness that the other staff had offered, without the nervous excess of a woman auditioning for her position. She had simply answered, and when he had asked about the October deferral she had said she had already noted it, and he had looked at her for a moment, and she had met his eyes without any of the calculated downward cast that most women his mother's acquaintance employed when speaking to a viscount. And he had thought, I mean the brief way that one registers something and sets it aside as not presently relevant, that she was very awake. He had not revisited the thought. He had filed it as he filed most things he could not immediately act on, and gone back to the work of learning in a state he had avoided for years. The ledger was open on his desk, page 43, the notation. In her hand, he ran his finger along the line of the instrument reference and thought about the precision required to copy that correctly from a chancery roll in a crowded archive reading room, and about how old she would have been when she did it, and about how she had been carrying it for 3 years without once mentioning it. The clock in the passage struck 5. He heard from the entrance hall below the sound of the front door. In the drawing-room, Miss Rave had leaned very slightly toward Lady Dorothea and said, in a voice pitched for the intimacy of close proximity, that the steward's girl had returned and was at the door asking to see him. Lady Dorothea set down her cup. Her expression did not change precisely, but it arranged itself into something that suggested she considered this a minor inconvenience of the sort that minor people produce when they have not yet understood their situation. Lord Fenwick from the best chair heard the stir at the door and turned toward his wife with the reflexive curiosity of a man who attends these gatherings for exactly this kind of entertainment. "Good heavens," he said at a volume suited to the room. "Is that the steward's girl at the door? And what on earth has she got in her hand? She had the Crown's warrant in her hand. It was not a small document. It was sealed with the stamp of the Crown Estates Commission and signed by Josiah Croft, Crown Estates Commissioner for the Western Division, and it had been prepared in the Commissioner's office at Meryton between 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because she had arrived before the office opened, had waited on the step in the November cold until it did, and had laid before Mr. Croft the notation from the Chancery roll and the full text of the land grant instrument she had requested from the archive while she waited, and had explained, with the careful precision of a woman who has been preparing this explanation for 3 years, why the late Viscount's letter held no legal authority over a property that had been sealed under Crown grant before the Calder family's deed. Mr. Don Croft had been, she would recall later, the only person that day who had looked at her paperwork before looking at her. He had read everything she laid before him and said, after a silence, that he believed she was right, and that the process for issuing the warrant would take approximately 5 hours, and that she was welcome to wait. She had waited. She had arrived back at Ashcroft at 5 minutes before dusk. She had not knocked. She had walked to the front door, which was the door she had a right to use, and she had said to the footman who opened it that she wished to speak to Viscount Ashcroft, and the footman had looked at the document in her hand and at her face, and had stepped aside. Edmund came down the stairs. He did not run. He came down the stairs in the steady way he had of moving through this house, and Eleanor watched him descend and thought that she had been afraid of this moment on the coach road home, afraid that she had been wrong about the notation, about the instrument, about the ground she was standing on, and that she would arrive with the warrant, and he would look at it, and look at her with the polite, correct distance he had maintained for 6 months, and she would understand that the ledger had meant nothing, and the window had meant nothing, and she had invented a significance that was not there. She was still afraid. Her hands were cold, and she had been traveling since before 5 in the morning, and she had not eaten since yesterday evening, and the drawing-room door was open, and she could feel the pressure of the room's attention on her back. Edmund reached the foot of the stairs. He looked at the document in her hand. He looked at her face. He crossed the hall. The drawing-room door was open. Lady Dorothea had come to stand in the entrance to it with Miss Rave at her shoulder and Lord Fenwick 2 steps behind. The assembled evening company arranged behind them with the unconscious instinct of people who recognize that a scene is forming. Edmund stopped beside Eleanor, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He took the warrant from her hand. He read the first line. He read the commissioner's signature. He turned to face the drawing-room, where his mother stood. "Miss Brent holds the warrant," he said. "The cottage is hers." It was 9 words. He did not repeat them. He did not look to see whether anyone had understood them or whether they required elaboration or whether his mother's expression, which had passed through 3 distinct registers in the space of 2 seconds and arrived somewhere very still, indicated that she had chosen to dispute them. The warrant was the Crown's, and Mr. Capper. Croft's signature was on it, and the land grant instrument predated the Calder deed. And these were facts of the order that do not become less factual when a well-dressed woman in pearls decides to disagree with them. Lady Dorothea said, after a moment, "Edmund," he said, "you will want to speak with Mr. Hadley about the letter. Mr. Hadley was the estate solicitor. I will have him come tomorrow." Miss Rave had placed her hand on Lady Dorothea's arm. Her own expression had moved past the polished graciousness and arrived somewhere that was, Eleanor thought, almost honest. A young woman recalculating the ground beneath her. Mrs. Rave from deeper in the drawing-room made a small sound that might have been an attempt at conversation and abandoned it. Lord Fenwick turned back to his wife and said something low that she answered with a single murmured syllable. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell appeared at the top of the servants' stair with a cloth in her hands, as if she had been on her way somewhere and been distracted. She looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of a woman who had known Eleanor's father, and who had this morning watched Eleanor walk down the drive with her shoulders straight and her chin level, and had said nothing, because there was nothing she could say, and who was now looking at the document in his hand with a satisfaction so complete she did not bother to conceal it. Edmund turned back to Eleanor. He held the warrant out, and she took it. His fingers did not release it immediately. There was a half-second in which both their hands were on the document, and he looked at her with something that was not the polite, correct distance, and was not anything she had seen on his face in 6 months. And then he released the warrant and said quietly that she must be cold, and that she had not eaten, and that he would like to speak with her when she was ready. She said that she was ready now. He brought her to the study rather than the drawing room, which was, she understood, a choice that meant something. He poured her tea from the pot that had been sitting on the hearth-stand for the better part of an hour, and it was not hot, but it was warm, and she did not complain. He placed a plate of bread and butter on the desk in front of her because it was the only food that could be produced without going to the kitchen, and she ate 2 pieces of it while he stood at the window looking out at the last gray light going from the sky. And neither of them spoke for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. He said, without turning from the window, "I did not send you away." "I know," she said. "I did not know until 6 o'clock that you had gone." She said nothing to this. He turned from the window. He looked at her in the firelight, and she had eaten the bread and butter, and she was still cold still, in the way that comes from a long November day in a coach, and she was also the most awake she had felt in 3 months, since before her father died, since before the estate books had become something she kept in order, out of duty and grief rather than out of anything like satisfaction. He said, "I find I do not want you to go." The room held that sentence for a moment. She could feel her heartbeat in her wrists, which was inconvenient, given that she was trying to think clearly. He was close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes in the firelight, and smell the wool of his coat, which smelled of wood smoke and the cold of the evening, and the particular quality of a coat worn by someone who had been indoors all day, and could not account for that smell. What? And she thought that he had probably walked outside at some point, probably to the stables, probably pacing. She said, "The warrant is the Crown's. It cannot be withdrawn without going back to Mr. Croft's office." He said, "I am not speaking about the warrant." She set down her cup. But it was the right size of silence, the kind she had learned from him in 6 months of watching a man who knew how to let words occupy their actual space without filling them in. "I know," she said. He reached across the desk, not for her hand, for the ledger. He opened it to page 43 and looked at the notation she had written 3 years ago and the line she had added last week. His hand was on the page, and hers was on the table beside it, and the distance between them was perhaps 3 inches, and neither of them moved across it. She thought about what it would cost to move 3 inches. She thought about what it would cost not to. She moved her hand to the edge of the page. His hand did not move. His forefinger, resting on the notation, shifted by perhaps 1/4 of an inch and touched the edge of hers, and stopped. It was not nothing. He reached into his breast pocket with his other hand and took out a folded letter. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it on the desk between them. It was very old, the fold lines worn to white, the wax seal long since broken. He said, without looking at her, that his brother had written to him in February, and that he had received the letter after Frederick died, and that he kept it as a record of something he could not undo. She did not ask what it said. She looked at the letter on the desk, and then at him, and he was looking at it also with the expression of a man who is putting down something heavy very carefully. She said, "May I ask what it is you are carrying it for?" He said after a moment, "I suppose I thought I needed to remember." She said, "You know it. You do not need the paper to remember it." He looked at her. The firelight made his face particular, the jawline she had looked at across 100 practical exchanges in 6 months. The eyes she had studied for some indication of what he thought, and received very little. And what he thought now was there in full. Not hidden, not managed. Not arranged into the correct professional distance of a man who inherited a house he did not know how to deserve. He was 34 years old, and he had been in this room for 6 months, and he had walked to the window this morning at 6 o'clock, because he could not name what he felt when he watched her go. And he was naming it now. She said, "Frederick's letter will be here in the morning. The cottage will be here in the morning." he said very quietly. "Will you?" She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire had settled into a deep, even burn. Outside the study window, the November dusk had become full dark, and the first lamps were lit in the drive. And somewhere in the house the evening gathering was finding its way toward dinner, without the master, which was, she thought, their problem to manage. She said yes. He turned his hand on the page and his fingers closed over hers. Briefly, completely, and then released. He stood. She stood. They walked out of the study into the passage, and at the end of the passage was the servants' door that led to the kitchen garden, and from there to the steward's cottage. And he held the door for her, and they stepped out together into the cold dark. The path to the cottage was familiar to her in the dark as her own heartbeat. She had walked it 10,000 times. She walked it now with him beside her, not quite touching the warrant folded in her coat pocket, the cold air sharp and clear after the wood smoke warmth of the study. The cottage door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked because there was nothing inside worth stealing, only the furniture her father had bought, with 40 years of steady, careful service, the shelves of account books and legal digests, the fireplace that she knew how to lay and light with her eyes closed. She opened the door. She did not go in yet. He stood at the threshold behind her. She could feel the nearness of him, the warmth at her back. Neither of them moved. The cottage was cold, from the day without a fire, and dark only the faint orange of the last light from the kitchen garden, coming through the unshuttered window. And what came next could not be unmade, and they both understood it, and they stood there for a long moment, understanding it, and it was good to understand something that clearly. She said at last, "Come in." He did. That night, the Ashcroft housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, told the second footman, while setting out the cold supper the drawing-room company had eventually required, that in 30 years at this house she had never once seen a young woman walk out of the gate at dawn with a ledger under her arm, and walk back through the front door at dusk with the crown behind her. And she intended to tell her sister about it by Thursday post, and it would take more than one letter to say what needed saying. Miss Rave and her mother departed on the morning coach at 8:15. Lord Fenwick at breakfast said something about the warrant being a very neat piece of work, and then said nothing further, which was, in Lord Fenwick's case, a form of admiration. Lady Dorothea Calder spoke with Mr. Dodderay. Hadley the following morning. She was not a woman who revised easily, but she was also not a woman who preferred to occupy an incorrect position indefinitely once it had been demonstrated to be incorrect. She revised. It took the better part of an hour and a great deal of very careful conversation, and one moment in the middle of it, in which she looked at Mr. Raypod, Hadley, and said flatly that she supposed the girl had known about the grant all along, and Mr. Matter. Hadley said, in the measured tone of a solicitor who is choosing his words with the care they deserve, that Miss Brent had known about it for approximately 3 years, and had never once used it, until she had no other choice. Lady Dorothea did not comment on this. She set down her pen and looked out the window at the cottage across the kitchen garden. She did not comment. She sat with it. Alone in the morning room, for a long time. Edmund came to the cottage at 9 o'clock. Eleanor had laid a fire the night before, and it was burning warmly, and the kettle was on, and he knocked at the door and she opened it, and he came in and sat down in the chair that had been her father's chair, and she poured tea, and they talked for an hour about the quarry payment deferral and the tithe schedule, which had been in the accounts as a pending expense since August, and had not been addressed, and then they talked about other things, and the morning went on. On the mantel above the fire, Frederick's letter sat where Edmund had placed it the night before, propped against the clock, in the place where things that mattered were kept. He had not put it back in his pocket. Eleanor had not suggested he do so, and had not suggested he throw it away. It was there if he needed to look at it. He did not, she thought, need to look at it as often as he had. Outside the cottage window, the November morning was cold and clear. The kind of day that would have kept her inside with the accounts last week. The kind of day that would have made the drive look long and the gate look far. She looked at the window and at the garden beyond it, and at the lane where the beech leaves had finally let go, and lay along the verge in their brown and gold heaps, and at the Manor, beyond that which had always been part of the view from here. And she thought that some things look different when you have been outside them and come back. And some things look exactly the same. And the trick is knowing which is which. Edmund reached across the table and turned the ledger on page 43 to face him, and said that the notation was the most useful piece of paper he had seen since coming to Ashcroft, and she said that she had not been sure it was useful until she needed it to be, and he said that was usually how the most useful things worked, and she said yes. She supposed it was. The fire caught a new log and flared briefly and settled. She had come home. If Eleanor's warrant moved you, leave a word below. And thank you for staying until the end.